going on, guys? Welcome to episode 1 of the Learning to Hunt series here at Maneuver Outdoors. What we're going to be doing in this episode is we're just trying to understand the daily life cycle of whitetail deer. Where do they eat? Where do they sleep? Where do they get their water from? And the whole idea, let's just get a basic understanding of what deer do. We can, as you get more experience going on down the line, you can start to understand way more about it, but just general understanding is what we're going for right now of like what deer do, when they're going to do it. And we may touch a little bit on how you can actually exploit that when you're hunting. So let's go ahead and jump right into this thing. All right, 3 things really dictate a deer's pattern of life. You got food, you got water, and you got bedding areas or where they sleep. Now there is a 4th thing that dictates a deer patterns of life. We're going to dedicate a whole episode to that, though. Episode 2 is going to be dedicated to the rut or the deer's mating season. So we're going to come back to that, focus on that later. But for now, basic daily pattern of life is what we're going to look on. So let's go ahead and get right into this. Now I break food down into its own 3 separate categories as well. You're going to have browse, nuts and seeds, and agriculture. That's how I like to break it down, just to like think about the different ways of how they eat. Now before we get completely into the food, the deer in your area are going to have a primary source of food and they're going to have a secondary source of food. Now the primary one is going to be like the main meal. It's going to be their dinner, their breakfast, the main thing that they want to eat, that they're getting their nutrients from to help them survive. That's what they're going to go to first. Anything else is going to be considered secondary as like a nice to have. Now they're going to focus on that primary source. It doesn't mean that they're not going to eat the secondary source, but they're going to focus their time and energy on that primary source until it's either gone or something in the environment changes that now makes a secondary food source a primary food source. Now browse is basically just new growth. Anything that's growing that's edible, deer are going to eat it. You can think of things like sumac, dogwood, pine, cedar trees, like anything, all those little branches and stuff that's actually growing on those, deer are going to eat that. Now they can treat that as a primary food source where like that's where they're going to eat, but if they have other food sources that are better than that, they're going to go to those first. Browse is generally done more in the winter time when there's nothing else left, or if they're moving from point A to point B and they just come across it. The way you can think about it is almost like a snack food. Like when there's nothing else and they're hungry, they're going to eat that and they're just going to keep munching on it while moving to whatever's going to be the main thing that they want to eat. All right, nuts and seeds. Primarily going to be focusing on things like red oak, white oak, beech nuts, hickory nuts, pecans, anything that's a nut that falls from a tree, deer are going to flock to those things. Now, like in the area that I'm in right now, they really like those white oaks. Yeah, I can pretty much wager to say that if you can find a concentration of white oaks wherever you're hunting, there's going to be deer going to that area because deer love acorns and they're always going to go to those as a primary food source. Now, something to think about with this. They're going to go to those nuts. They're going to go to those acorns or those beech nuts or whatever it is before they eat that browse. So like they're going to eat down the nuts and the berries and all those things. They're going to eat those first before they start focusing on browse. So if there's still acorns on the ground, they're still going to be going to those things until those are gone. Then they'll start focusing on the browse. Like I said, they may go and eat a little bit of browse as they're going to and from, or like they just find it and they decide to munch on it right now, but they're going to primarily go to that major food source like those acorns first to eat that first because that's where they're going to get their most nutrients. All right, and our last food source, agriculture. Now, I clump agriculture into its own area simply because there's just so much of it. This is like alfalfa, corn, soybeans, anything that grows tall, they're going to use it as both a bedding area and as a food source. Anything that grows kind of low, they're just going to use it as a food source, but that's going to be the main thing. If they know it's there, they're going to flock to it right away because it's such an abundant food source. In most areas, like, you know, like if you take the Midwest, for example, like deer are going to focus heavily on agricultural fields to the point that it's actually like a problem in the farming industry of deer damage. The same way that hogs down in the south are causing damage, deer cause the same type of damage to agricultural fields because they focus so heavily on that food source. All right, so now that you know those 3, like what I was talking about before we even started, primary and secondary food sources, want to show you an example of how those could change and how those go into it. So it's like late summer right now, you know, it's after the 4th of July, it's August time frame. Corn is really high, you know, the entire, you know, Midwest area is completely ready to be harvested. Everything's grown. Deer are feeding heavily on those corn, on that soybean, on that alfalfa. They're in it, they're eating those because it's an easy food source, easy for them to get. But then October rolls around, September, October rolls around, and the harvest comes. Those farmers now take all of that food source away. They remove it because now they're actually going to use it. So now that food source is gone. So now their primary food source has been removed. So they're going to focus on the next most abundant thing. Well, because it's fall, acorns are dropping now. So the deer shift their focus from that agricultural field into the acorns. So now the acorns are their primary food source. They may still go to an ag field to poke around to see if there's something left, but they're primarily now going to where those acorns are to eat there. A couple of months go by, you know, it's now late November, early December, maybe even January, and those acorns are either covered in snow or they've just all been eaten up. So now primary food source is now shifted from acorns to whatever they can find. So now we're in that browse section where anything that's growing, anything that's available to them that's green or has nutrients in it, they're going to eat it. So like that sumac, those dogwoods, the piney, cedars are really good. They're going to be going to those things. Anything that has nutrients, they're going to be going to those areas and they're going to be browsing on that until the spring comes and the new shoots come up. People start planting food again and they can start focusing on that new food source. Another thing to add with this, like if you're in a suburban area, the deer's primary food source could literally just be your backyard. Like if you're seeing deer consistently every single night there, and they're just seem to just be sitting there eating whatever's there, like your grass, your flowers, anything like that, your backyard could literally be the deer's primary food source, and that could help you easily pattern where they're living, what they're doing, by just having your house be the starting point. Next thing, water. Pretty self-explanatory with water. Now, everything in the world needs to drink or needs to hydrate in one way, shape, or form. It is a place for you to start to see where the deer are doing. So you can start there by going over there and seeing where along that water source, whether it's a river, a pond, a lake, or stream, where along that water source are they actually concentrating, consistently going back to get drinks of water, and where along that route can you then place yourself to actually be helpful. Now if it's like a small pond, you may be able just to sit above the pond and see where those deer are actually coming in and get good shots from that pond. But if it's something like, you know, a large river or a large lake, you got to identify where along that actual thing are the deer concentrated in. And that's going to be as simple as just going to that water source and walking around it, walking up and down it until you find lots of deer sign, prints, you know, browse being eaten down, physically seeing deer, scat, anything in there that's telling you that the deer are concentrating themselves in this particular spot. All right, now we got that last one that we're talking about, bedding areas. Now we can boil bedding down into 3 factors as well. All right, it's going to be security, relative location, and wind. All right, let's talk about security. Now, security is basically just what makes that animal feel safe enough to take a break, to rest, to you know, recuperate, to let his guard down for a little bit of time. That's going to primarily be things like heavy cover, so thick underbrush, tall grass. Remember we talked about agriculture earlier. A cornfield, a deer getting into a cornfield feels really secure inside of that thing because they're hidden, because they feel secure inside of that thing, and they can hear things coming from any direction inside of that cornfield. Things like, you know, a cedar grove, you know, a thick, heavy covered pile of trees or anything like that, something they can get into in and out of easily, but something else they'll be able to see, hear, smell coming in and out of and allow them to escape. That's what they're going to focus on in terms of where they're actually going to lay down, is that heavy security cover. Now, the second thing, relative location. Now, just because there is a, you know, good thicket of heavy cover in this location, if it's not near a food source, not near a water source, they're not going to stay in that heavy cover that's got nothing else around it, simply because it's too much energy to get from that position to wherever their food source is or wherever that water source is. So when you're out there looking for where you think that they're bedding down, you're looking for that heavy security cover in vicinity of somewhere else that has a heavy food source, that primary food source and water. This is why deer like agricultural fields so much. Like a cornfield gives them both bedding and food in the same exact location, so they don't have to go very far. The only thing they have to find now is water. Now the last factor, wind. Now wind is one of the most important things for you as a hunter to be able to understand because of how deer actually use it. So we're going to talk about how a deer uses it in this episode. Later on in the series, when we actually go out and we're on the hunt and we're moving around looking for deer, we'll talk about how you as a hunter is going to use the wind to your advantage. Now a deer's nose is basically unbeatable for you as a hunter, because there are like 300 million receptors inside of a deer's nose. You have about 5 million inside yours right now. To put that in perspective, tracking dogs that we have, whether it's bomb dogs, blood dogs, bloodhounds, anything like that, a deer's nose is like 2 or 3 times more powerful than that dog's. So there's not much you can really do if if a deer smells you, because then they're going to wind you and they're going to run away. So the way that they're going to use the wind to their advantage is they may not necessarily completely change bedding areas, but where they bed down inside that bedding area is going to be relative to where that wind is. Now let's use that cornfield as a quick example for how that's going to actually work. If the wind's coming from the north, the deer are going to bed on the south side of that cornfield because, one, it's going to keep them protected from the wind, and anything coming through that cornfield that they couldn't physically see, they'll be able to smell. And then anything that's approaching from the southern side, because they're laying on that southern side, they'll be able to see it coming out of that location and be able to react to it. Now, if the wind's coming from a direction that doesn't make that bedding area a very secure location, whether it's from the wrong direction, they can't see anyone, they may just completely leave that bedding area for another one that's adjacent to them. Now, the same deer may have 2 or 3 different bedding areas that they go to simply based off of how the wind goes. Now, there are specific animals that may not do that, so like trophy bucks, which we're not really focusing on in this thing because we're just trying to get on deer, but like a trophy buck may bed in the same bed to like day in and day out, simply because that's the place that he's most comfortable with and that's the place that he knows he can survive the most. But those areas are going to be very, very specific, that gives him the best advantage no matter what what the entire environment is, and that's why it's so difficult to get in on those guys and get used to those guys. But we're not talking about trophy bucks right now because we're just trying to get in on some deer. Now backtrack real quick. Wind is going to dictate how they approach those food and water sources as well. They're not just going to walk randomly up into that clearing no matter what direction the wind is blowing. If the wind is blowing from one direction, they're probably going to come from the opposite side of that wind so they can smell anything that's in that clearing before they walk into it. Same thing with the water. If anything's coming from the water, they're going to want to approach that water source in a direction that they can smell either what's at the water now or what's coming to the water from a different direction, so while they're drinking, they feel safe while they're there. All right, before we wrap everything up, there's a couple other things that I want to talk about specific to a deer's anatomy that I want you guys to understand. First off, their hearing. They have extremely good hearing. You're not going to be able to really talk if you're sitting in a deer stand, or if you're in and around deer, they will be able to hear you fairly well. Think about like how your dog or a cat can hear you even if you're whispering across the house. Treat it the same way. With that though, you don't have to be completely silent. You just have to make sure that your noises that you're making are natural. So you need to eliminate any human noises that you may be making. If I'm just walking through the woods, a deer may not identify you as a human, but they're going to be able to hear you. Whereas if I'm talking, deer are going to immediately know that you're a human, and then they're going to identify you. So you don't necessarily have to be completely 100% dead quiet. You just have to eliminate the human noises that you're making. Other thing, a deer's eyesight is extremely good in one sense and absolutely horrible in the other sense. Now, because a deer is a prey species, they have lost the ability to see definition. However, they can detect movement way better than we can. Even that little twitch, a slight head turn, anything like that, even you blinking sometimes, they can pick that up if they're looking directly at you. Now, a deer's eye's location on its head gives it a wide range of view, so just because they're facing away from you doesn't mean that they can't see you. Now, if it's directly away from you and the deer is looking straight away from you, no, they can't see you. But if the deer's head is only turned 45 degrees, you'll be picked up in their peripheral vision, and that movement they can pick up really, really well. With that, everything in the woods moves. It just doesn't move rapidly. Rapid movement is associated with a threat. Other animals, other deer, trees, leaves, everything moves. Rapid movement is the thing that really attracts deer's attention. If I like snap my arm back here to grab my bow and pick it up, that could be a problem because the deer are going to see that and are going to treat it as a threat. But if I'm waiting for like, you know, the wind to blow and as everything's moving with it, I'm just gently moving my hand back here, going to actually grab it. They may see it, but they're not going to associate it as a threat because it's just part of the natural background. And you can get a feel for that as you're out there of like, how fast can I move based off of the changing environment. So like, let's say there's a day where everything's completely still, I'm probably going to be extremely still as well. But if it's like a high wind day where everything's moving rapidly going through it, I might be able to get away with a little bit more movement because the deer's eyesight has been overloaded with so much movement right now that that natural arm swing that I'm doing is kind of blended into the background of movement. All right, last thing that I want to hit. Deer primarily operate during the hours of dawn and dusk. Their eyesight, yes, they can see movement a lot better, but not as good. They can't see as definition as good as us, but their night vision is also a lot better than ours. So deer aren't like us that are going to do, you know, an 8-hour sleep cycle. They're going to get, you know, a couple of minutes of rest here and there. So they're going to be active throughout the entire day, but what they're doing and when is going to be dictated. So going out to the feeding areas, going out to get water is going to be done during that dawn and dusk period. Midway through the day, midway through the night, they're going to be in those bedding areas. They may not be asleep and they may be moving around a little bit, but they're not going long distances during those times because they're either resting or they're waiting for the sun to come back up, or it's too dark for them to move. The prime time is what we call is like the first hour of light and the last hour of light is the prime time to be hunting because that's the highest activity that you're going to see of deer during the entire day hunt. So, recap, we've got 3 main things that dictate a pattern of life of deer. So we got number 1, food, number 2, water, and then that last one's going to be bedding areas where it is. All right, remember, inside food, worry about what is the primary food source for that deer in your area, followed by those secondaries, and you can start to figure out almost like, you know, primary, secondary, tertiary, what they're going to focus on at what time of the year. Second to that is going to be that water source. Where are they getting their water from? How often do they go there? Where can you set yourself up to exploit that? And the last one, bedding area. Break it down into the 3 things: security, relative location, and wind direction. Applying those factors, where are the deer going to bed down? Once we have all those things, then we can identify that entire pattern of life. If they're bedded down in this location, when it comes time for them to move at that dawn or dusk time, are they going to go to the food? Are they going to go to the water? How long are they going to be there? And what are their routes going to and from those things? And that gives you the ability to predict where they're going to be at what time. So this allows you to identify the best position to get a shot off at them during your hunt and ultimately making you successful. Guys, if you like this video, go ahead, hit a like, subscribe, throw a comment down in the bottom. Let me know what you think. What did I not cover that you want to know that I can hit in either like an additional video or want to follow on ones? Let me interact with you guys because you guys are the new hunters. I've got the knowledge. Let me help you guys with what's going on with this. We'll see you guys on the next one.